What's up, guys? It's Sam. Here at Fresh Start, we don't always have the time to talk in depth about more serious issues within the gaming industry. But I want to delve a bit deeper into a rising issue, so let's take a moment and pause. For years now, debates have raged on over whether or not video game violence makes gamers, particularly children, more aggressive. Some studies suggest that there's a positive correlation, some suggest there's a negative correlation, and some see no correlation at all. But one thing that these studies have in common is that none of them show any long-term negative effects of video game violence. One video game study measured a handful of college-aged guys, half of whom played Mortal Kombat and the other half played a non-violent game. After playing, they were asked to distribute hot sauce to another group of participants. Those who played Mortal Kombat gave more hot sauce to the participants than those who played a non-violent game. Undoubtedly, this helps prove the argument that video game violence may influence short-term aggressiveness, but similar studies have shown no prolonged negative effects of video game violence on the human psyche. The main argument that anti-violent video game proponents have is that there is a positive correlation between violent video games and real-world crime rates in the United States. The issue with this argument is that it's false. Research has shown that there is in fact no relationship between the two. Rather, the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, as well as the National Crime Victimization Survey, among others, show that the overall crime rate in the United States has decreased dramatically since the early 2000s. Now, it's inaccurate to claim that this correlation implies causation, but it would be more believable than the arguments put forward by organizations like Mothers Against Video Game Addiction and Violence or Jack Thompson, an anti-video game anything activist. Obviously, there are issues with the research methods regarding video game violence studies. The majority of studies only use the absolute most violent games, along the lines of Mortal Kombat, God of War, or Manhunt. Video game violence goes far beyond humans shedding blood, though. Games like Halo, Dota, or Team Fortress do have violence, but it's portrayed differently, either comically or against non-human foes. But nobody has considered examining how these less realistic and occasionally lighthearted representation of violence impact players, or rather if it has any effect at all. A recent study took Half-Life 2 and modified it to have two versions. One version was the original game, while the other version altered the violence so that instead of shooting enemies, players would tag them and they would slowly evaporate. Both the violent and non-violent versions included a brief tutorial explaining the controls, but only half of the participants playing the violent version received the tutorial, and half the participants playing the non-violent version received the tutorial. What the study showed was that players who did not receive the tutorial showed much more obvious signs of aggression and frustration than those who did receive the tutorial, regardless of which version of the game they played. This says a lot about the previous arguments towards the supposed impact of video game violence on players. Researchers have their subjects play violent games with the intention of gathering the results they desire. Rarely, if ever, do they stack up results of multiple types of video games against each other. I have yet to see a study that compares the aggressiveness of people playing Gears of War with people playing Portal. If the results of the study I just mentioned are to be trusted, the challenge and difficulty of the puzzles in Portal should make players more aggressive than those playing Gears of War. But here's something interesting. There is actually a negative relation between violent video games and violent crime. Over the last 15 years, violent crime has been steadily decreasing. It is simply arrest rates that are going up, which is why everyone thinks our country is getting more dangerous. The reality is that violent crimes are much less prevalent today than they were back in the 90s. The presence of violent video games, on the other hand, has steadily been increasing. Games back in the 90s were, of course, very gruesome, as anybody who played Doom or Duke Nukem will recall, but the variety of violent and gory games today is much wider than 20 years ago. Yet, people jump at the opportunity to blame the video game industry, despite the rates of game sales and crime going in opposite directions. My personal opinion is that parents need to take responsibility and actually parent. If you don't want your child to get a sugar high off of chocolate, you won't buy them a chocolate bar. If you do get them a chocolate bar and they get a sugar high, are you going to blame the manufacturer, or are you just going to stop buying them candy? How about you don't want your child to see violent images and potentially learn from them, but you buy them an M-rated game and they express signs of aggression after playing it? Why is it now the developer's fault? As a parent, you are responsible for teaching your child the difference between a fictitious game and reality. If you don't want to risk it, just don't get them those kinds of games. There are ESRB ratings for a reason. M-rated games are not made for kids, so don't buy them for kids. It's really that simple. The facts are there. When you put aside the research bias, self-fulfilling prophecies, and lack of internal validity, these studies all point to the same thing. There is no proof that violent video games cause violent behavior any more than other genres. Rather, aggression is more likely to occur when the game being played is difficult, regardless of its content. So maybe we need to stop blaming the video game industry for putting out violent games and teach our children that 1. Video games are not real and should not be taken seriously, and 2. Puzzle games are significantly more dangerous to them than mindless killing games. So who knows, maybe the next time you play Little Big Planet with a friend, you'll be more likely to knock them out than if you had just gone with their suggestion and played Titanfall.